Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. The show where each and every week we dive into a different album and discuss what's going on, right? So in today's episode I have another unusual album, of course. This album joins alongside videos on the likes of like Fly Panam, Shalabi Effect, Alexandre St-Onge. Essentially, as I've mentioned a couple of times, one reason why I opened up the entire Weird Music series with Shalabi Effect was because I wanted to eventually follow the various threads that intertwined itself with so many Canadian experimental artists. There's so many different things I just want to discuss, so many different bands, collaborations and side projects. And so this particular band, it's one I came across on an old brainwashed article on Godspeed You Black Emperor, I believe. I could be wrong, but essentially it acted as a directory for so many of the different bands all connected to Godspeed You Black Emperor. I believe somebody has done a much more concise look at all this on Rate Your Album, which would definitely be worth diving in, but there's literally hundreds upon hundreds of albums on there. Anyway, came across the Brainwashed article and it introduced me to this little band that we're looking at today. So maybe over a decade ago, I want to say, I somehow managed to purchase all three releases by this particular act, which is an incredibly illogical string of releases, I have to say. But more of that later, because we're going to start with the very beginning of their discography. So today, I present St-Onge's debut album, Locust. So of course, who are St-Onge? Well, St-Onge is a collaborative group, originally started by members Alexandre St-Onge of Shalabi Effect, Klaxon Gluel, Feu Therese and many, many more, as well as Roger Tellier Craig of Fly Panam, Chic Chich and even Set Fire to Flames. So St-Onge, a rather strange project with 3 releases in their discography. A follow-up album that was released on Squidfucker Press, and then a final release released on Alienate that expanded the project with new members. But more on these another day, right? So what is Locust then? Well, this is the debut album from St-Onge, released on Locust Music back in 2001, but as its second official release. So this is our introduction to Roger Tellier Craig and Alexandre St-Onge collaborating on some really unusual, unsettling nonsense of sorts. This is a very odd release, something that I've had in my music collection for many, many years now. A strange 40-minute composition that is perhaps amongst one of the most strange releases from members of the Canadian experimental music scene, often to create this large, murky, meandering soundscape sourced from guitars, electronics and voices. It's a kind of composition that just confuses me. Something I could barely comprehend over a decade ago when I first discovered it, and something I can hardly comprehend now, I have to admit. It's also one of those releases that tells us incredibly little as to what's going on. All of the liner notes are in French, which is great for my regrettably monolinguistic self. A huge regret of my life, I should say. However, some rudimentary translation software does tell us a little bit more, notably the use of contrabass and either manipulated vocals or multiplied vocals by Roger Tellier Craig, and then electric guitar and either manipulated or multiplied vocals by Alexandre St-Onge. Hard to know. If they're manipulated, maybe that's where the electronics come from. If they're multiplied, then I don't know what's going on. But the translation software said multiplied for some reason, but who knows? Anyway, as well as this though, there is actually a small quotation on the inside sleeve that, when translated, tells us the following. Friends to that state of friendship, where a man abandoned by all his friends, meets in death the one who will accompany him beyond life, himself without life, capable of free friendship detached from all ties. MB quoting GB. So, not really a lot for us to go on. But considering the absurd minimalist nature of this recording, I do wonder if we're supposed to be reading more into this, or then again, maybe this is meant to throw us more off track. To be honest, it's really hard to tell when it comes to these particular dudes. With both of their involvement in the Canadian avant-garde music scene, and in particular to both of their contributions to the wonderful Fly Pan Am, Roger Tellier as a member and Alexandre de St-Onge as a guest, trickery on the audience is just par for the course with them. And thus I wonder how much of this is just meant to be a bit tongue-in-cheek perhaps. Always hard to say, but it's actually something I've always appreciated about their music on the different kinds of albums they've released. Never really knowing if it's meant to make sense, or if it's meant to confuse you, or if they're trying to trick you, or if they're not. Before I get ahead of myself though, I am here to discuss this album, so let's crack on. So we have what opens this one, just a very unsettling low-end rumble, a dragging of what sounds like a bow across the strings of a double bass, most likely, the contrabass I would assume, and this slightly sour undulation of sub-sounds, constantly occurring like a mirage, just over the top like a guitar sometimes, but most seldomly, sometimes seldomly plays a glide of a note perhaps, a faint remnant of a singular tone, and a few abstractions being pulled across the very body of the instruments itself, it feels. This is essentially our setting for 40 minutes. This is what we're in store for. And I don't know why, but I have always found this album to be so magically impenetrable. When first diving into the many offshoots of Fly Pan Am, I remember finding the Brainwashed article that mentioned a whole bunch of different related projects for the various members, from Godspeed to Fly Pan Am and so on and so forth. And it was an invaluable resource for myself at that time, in pointing me in the direction of some lesser known projects in the Canadian experimental scene. The reason why I bring this up is because one name that kept popping up was Et-Sans, a band with 3 albums under their belt as mentioned. And after purchasing a second-hand copy of the band's final release, this one here, which I'm not even going to try say the name of, I gave up on trying to find the second album here, as this was a miniature release from Squintfucker Press. And then trying to find this one was an impossibility. But of course I've got all of them right here, don't I? Eventually I found them all. But yes, I was, out of the 3 albums though, I was always drawn to Locust for some reason. Although I didn't know what it sounded like, it mentioned it being a 40-minute composition. And I remember at the time foolishly thinking that because it was very long and involved some artists from bands I already liked, like Godspeed You Black Emperor and Fly Pan Am and stuff, that it'd be very interesting, right? So eventually I managed to finally source a copy. Gave it a listen, probably at a very low volume that I simply wasn't able to comprehend what I was hearing, and I kind of thought nothing more of it at the time. I never quite figured it out, truth be told, but I always came back to this album over the various years, desperately trying to pry away at its tough exterior. The main bulk of this whole album operates under very minimalist notions, really drawing so little from the double bass and the guitar, and it just results in a very long composition that just seems to meander about. And I remember finding it particularly fascinating at first, but with each and every listen, it feels like you're discovering new things about it, more just buried within that complete dense miasma of fog and noise. One of the things that kind of first started to stand out to me was just this constantly unsettling and foreboding atmosphere. With that undulating bass pushing along so constantly, it feels like you're always in motion of sorts, but so painfully slowly it feels, just dragging yourselves along so weakly with just absolutely no urgency whatsoever. It does appear though, about roughly 12 minutes in, you do actually get a subtle noticeable change, which after such a long while of waiting for, comes in out of nowhere it feels, especially if you're kind of just lost and unaware of what you're hearing. It's like a switch is clicked and suddenly the landscape suddenly changed. And you get what sounds like a sudden appearance of an electronic that comes in from nowhere, a sudden morphing of the scene entirely. A sudden deluge of these strange lowercase electronics that kind of act like a breakdown of the very composition we're experiencing. The layer of the basic guitar are almost unable to support this growing deluge of electronic interference and feedback, and it becomes such a mesmerising part of the set, a kind of navigation to such a strange soundscape that cannot be comprehended. But still, with so little arguably happening for the most part, and the changes usually being so subtle, it becomes very difficult to picture the larger picture here. Even as the sounds just devolve in such a wonderful deluge of effects, those garbled voices captured to cassettes and run through further effects into the realms of lowercase, I find it to be so fascinating, creepy, and foreboding. I find myself very hypnotised by the whole experience, kind of overwhelmed by the nothingness occurring, that it makes it all just incomprehensible to me. My awareness, unable to pick out any details in its composition, no matter how roughly strewn or stretched into distortion. But regardless of it, a part of me is definitely enjoying the entire thing. This whole composition is one that just seems to unfurl so oddly, like the persistence of that bass and guitar, offset now by a flurry of electronic sound interaction that result in this constantly evolving picture, but one that seems to be remaining in the same space entirely. But it is navigating it through a different reality, perhaps. What was once a scene of rather drab, empty interiors has now become flecked with the stains of dirt and dust, kicked up by that static of interference. And it's without a doubt one of the slowest moving compositions I've come across, one that oozes out like the flow of radioactive sludge perhaps, its details only being the most briefest of sound occurrences that hardly feel musical, even when it is evidently the slight twang of an actual string from one of the instruments here. What truly amazes me about this whole album, essentially, is how it's comprised of both electric guitar and contrabass, as well as vocals from both musicians. But even with that knowledge, I cannot fathom where most of it all comes from, especially the voices. How do these two individuals get their instruments and voice to sound like this? There's no mention of any sort of electronic laptops or nothing, yet I feel unmistakably to me there's been some evident tampering of sounds of some form, hence why I think it is electronic, but I don't know. To me, it just further is throwing it all into levels, both further levels of abstraction and incomprehensibility. When listening to this, you either just let the music occur, without it really giving it much of a second thought for the most part, letting it meander along at that slow, incredibly slow pace. But if you try to delve into it, try to excavate the layers of nothingness and peculiarities that are evident on this recording and find any form of answers, you're just left with nothing. You don't find out anything. And if anything, it's a type of recording that kicks up more questions than it actually answers. Trying to figure it out, this enigma of a recording just leaves me completely stumped, and I'm left hypnotised and in awe of the extreme strangeness this entire composition offers. What is going on here? I have no idea, and that's fine. It's fine to not really know or understand what's going on, right? Of course, the more this all moves along, the more stranger and stranger it all seems to occur. Out of the murmuring rumble of contrabass, we suddenly get more occurrences of the guitar gently twanging a series of notes that barely forms a melody, all the while the continued garble of interference just clouding that entire picture. And it feels very unusual, as from the minimalist notions to the sound palette itself, it's all resulting in a composition that kind of feels circular in nature to this extent, constantly retreading the same ground that has already been established, and forcing you to question your own very perception of what it is you're listening to. I think it's definitely down to the strange effect minimalist music just has, whether your attention just ebbs and pulls through the duration of these tracks, captured by certain sections, whether it be something new that sounds just a little bit different, or be it that sudden awareness of deja vu, thinking, wait a minute, hasn't this already happened before? And with it being such a long composition, there's so much time for it slow to play all these little different tricks on you. That sense of sabotage and tricking the audience. It's something that has always drawn me to the music of these individuals. Especially when it comes to the work of Fly Pan Am, there's so many odd moments on all of their albums that take you out of the listening experience entirely, which oddly enough becomes a part of that particular listening experience. There's a good example of this on the band's second album, where one of the tracks literally has the sound of a CD skipping. So when you listen to it on your headphones, you feel like the audio recording has been sabotaged, and it really fucks with your perception. I feel like there's some same level trickery on this one, though it's in certain places, it all just slowly drifts past, not really caring if you're keeping up. And especially towards the end of the entire thing, you're getting some of the truly strangest things that could happen, and you wouldn't have any clue of it because you're just so stunned and placed into a state of stupor as a result of listening to it up to this point anyway. It's all just so bizarre though. And it's always been something that just fascinated me when I was a lot younger. Just the decision to release music that sounds like this on physical media. It's always been something that drew me to the experimental music scene, I have to say. Just questioning the decisions that goes into the making of albums like this. But then also considering the fact that its existence of being exactly what it is why they decided to make it in the first place. And I applaud that. The lack of care for the commerciality of music, but rather just the artistic merit of going into experimentation. It results in something more often than not unique for its own reasons. Nothing else quite feels like this, like it, and that's what makes it oddly special. And for me, I can't think of music that sounds quite like this, truth be told. Like, I'm sure somebody else might be able to, but I personally struggle. It barely even sounds like what it's portraying itself as being for the most part, so what should I even believe anymore? I don't know. So before we truly get lost, a better summarise and bring this thing to a close, right? This to me has always been a rather bewildering and strange album. There's something just so unclassifiable about it, something I just cannot quite put my finger on. And although I know that I enjoy this for what it is, I always remember coming across it as, and it was sometime after I first got into Godspeed You Black Emperor. One thing I quickly realised about Godspeed was that when I first discovered him, was that its many different members were involved in so many different bands that go well beyond the well-known ones of A Civil Mount Zion and Set Fire to Flames. The list goes far beyond, right into the heart of the experimental Canadian scene. And as I mentioned, I remember one of the greatest resources in discovering this being that brainwashed website that compiles so much information on the band, including a comprehensive list on many of its side projects. It helped introduce me to a lot of different bands and artists, but one that always piqued my curiosity was the mention of St-Onge and the album Locust, a brief mention of a 42-minute track, and it being a collaboration between Roger Tellier Craig and Alexandre St-Onge. It was all I could find out about this album because there were never any samples of tracks that I could listen to. So I just remember at that young age, or youngish age, always trying my hardest to discover what this sounded like. I wanted to discover the truth of it until I was eventually able to finally purchase a second-hand copy from somewhere. Like, I don't even remember where I picked this up from. Might have been eBay, might have been Amazon, I have no clue, but somehow I got one. And inside was this very strange lowercase composition that seemingly went nowhere. And ever since then, it has always remained in the back of my mind, something that I always think to when thinking about the experimental Canadian scene. Strange because it actually feels a little bit unremarkable in some respects, but I find it fascinating and absurdly interesting in its own right. Even listening to it now, well over a decade later, I find myself still so enamoured with its strange and impenetrable aesthetic. The whole thing just slowly simmers away, like a pot left to boil upon the stove, without ever devolving into anything cataclysmic, truth be told. Certainly strange, but what's actually stranger still is where this project eventually ended up. We do have the small mini CDR which was released on Squidfucker Press, a sort of short 18-minute composition which I think will be worth diving into because these tiny little albums are fascinating, and this one was such a difficult one to get a hold of, but eventually got one. The other one though is the band's final album, which I'm still not going to say the name of. It's too long and in French and spelled incorrectly. But this one, they opened up the band actually and introduced members Felix Morel from 5 Pan Am, Sophie Trudeau of Godspeed You Black Emperor and the Silverman Zion, and Stephen Deliverer, who I believe played with Feu Therese. Anyway, with these members all together, they moved away from the lowercase instances into something truly bizarre with this one. And I'm excited to talk about this album when we get around to it because it is mental. Some of the most bewildering music of all time. But more on those another day. So I think with that, we'll be coming to the end of our episode of Weird Music. Very glad to be, returning to the offshoot bands from the experimental Canadian scene. Like I'm trying to slowly open it up a bit more, and I need to delve into a lot more of them. Like I said, there's a lot I want to cover on the show. Some will eventually get round to, some I definitely need to sit down and focus upon. But I'm glad to have opened up, finally talked about St-Onge, you know. As strange as this one is, I just really like it for some reason. I like this band and their small discography. And this is an album that actually really helped my understanding of experimental music, of what constitutes a musical release and what it means to be experimental. And as well, it features some of my favourite experimenters of music, especially Alexandre St-Onge, who just entered creating some of the most enigmatic recordings I think I've ever come across. It'll be cool to explore more another day. So yeah, if you've made it this far, let us know in the comments what some of your favourite projects that are tangentially related to Godspeed You Black Emperor are. It'd be interesting to know of some I haven't heard of. I'm sure there is some. With that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.